Okay, let's start. Good night. Oh, I'm sorry. Good morning, everybody. My name is Novi Susilowati. I'm from Universitas Negeri Malang, Indonesia. Now I teach Indonesian for foreign speakers in Faculty of Letters. Now I will present my paper. The title of my paper is The Mapping of Language Teaching Materials of Indonesian Language for Foreign Speakers based on the linguistic characteristic. This is my background of my study. The development of Indonesian learning has increased significantly over time, including in PRC, People's Republic of China. So they send their students to study Indonesian language in Indonesia. Indonesian learning for foreign speaker is called BIPA, or bahasa Indonesia untuk penutur asing. And the next I will use the term of BIPA. There were two types of BIPA learning. The one is BIPA for general purposes and BIPA for academic purposes. In English learning, we know English for academic purposes. BIPA for academic purposes is similar to English for academic purposes. And one of the aspects that affect the successful learning of BIPA is teaching materials, because teaching materials can be used for independent and structured learning. Good teaching material are teaching materials that are in accordance with the characteristic of the student and close to the student's style. But all of this time, there is no teaching material for BIPA for academic purposes. So the teacher used sporadic materials to teach the student of BIPA for academic purposes. Based on that fact, we need to study the student linguistic characteristic to map the language teaching materials for BIPA students, especially for BIPA for academic purposes. This is my research objective. The first is to identify the linguistic characteristics of BIPA for academic purposes students, especially students for China, because they join BIPA for academic purposes program. And the second is to map the language teaching materials that will be developed into BIPA for academic purposes teaching materials. This is the method of my research, data and data source. The data of the research were in the form of oral and written verbal data. Oral verbal data were in the form of transcription of student utterance during the learning process. Written verbal data were in the form of written lingual features obtained from students' writing in the form of journal containing a number of essays about their activities, experiences, and feelings. The subject of my research is 8 students from China that joining the BIPA for academic purposes program in my university. The data collection is by observation and document analysis. This is my research stage. The first is observe the classroom teaching and learning, and then transcribe the classroom teaching and learning activities, and then analyzing the student journal, interpret the finding, mapping the teaching materials, and conclude the finding. This is my finding and discussion. My finding is the linguistic characteristic. There are 3 linguistic characteristics. The first is phonological characteristic, and the second is morphological characteristic, and the third is syntactic characteristic. From phonological characteristic, there are 5 findings. The first, students have no difficulty in pronouncing and distinguish vowel sound in their allophone. But the second one, the student have difficulty in pronounce and distinguish certain consonant sound, especially consonant P and D, K and G, P and D. So when they want to pronounce consonant P, they will pronoun be, or when they want to pronounce G, they will pronounce K. So when they want to say, for example, babi, they will say papi, not babi, but papi. When they want to say ganteng, they will say kanteng, not ganteng. Or when they will say teman, they will say teman, not teman. They have a difficulty to distinguish that certain consonant sound. In consonant sound, the analysis also showed that students are not able to pronounce the sound R. In Chinese language, there are no R sound, so they cannot pronounce R sound. And students have difficulty to pronounce cluster. For example, they can pronounce word program. They have difficulty to pronounce that because there are a cluster in that word. From morphological characteristic, students have been able to produce words by using affix, especially prefix and suffix. The affix that they most correctly mastered by the student are affix menasal in bahasa Indonesia, menasal, ter, ber, and pen. And the other affix they have difficulties to use the other affix. They tend to experience difficulty in forming the word with basic form beginning with consonant key. For example, in Indonesia, there are the word kupas. They will experience difficulty in forming mengupas, menasal with kupas. They will say not mengupas, but mengkupas. In Indonesian language, menasal, if we want to forming the word with basic form beginning with K, P, T, and S, with the affix menasal, they will be, for example, mengupas, not mengkupas. In Indonesia, there are words paku with menasal. It will be memaku, not mempaku. That's right. The student tend to experience difficulty in forming that word. And the student have difficulties in producing the word with G affix D. For example, G makan. In Indonesian, there are memakan and dimakan. The student tend to have difficulties in using the word with G affix. From syntactic characteristic, the student are already good enough in producing simple sentence, subject and verb, but the student have difficulties in changing active sentence into passive sentence. For example, saya membaca buku. Saya membaca buku is active sentence, and then the student have difficulty in changing the active sentence into passive sentence. Buku dibaca saya. They cannot make that sentence, the passive sentence. Now, from the linguistic characteristic that we found, we mapped the teaching material to make the easier for studying Indonesian. This is the mapping of teaching material that we mapped from phonological aspect, morphological aspect, and syntactic aspect. From this mapping, we have note this. Consonant sound, mainly P and B, K and K, also T and G, they tend to have difficulties. So we get more repetition and highlight with this teaching material. And also for morphological aspect, student tends to experience difficulties with affix G So we also get more repetition and highlight when they learn affix D. And also passive sentence, including change from passive to active and vice versa. We got more repetition and highlighted. Okay, this is my conclusion of my study. From the aspect phonology, Chinese students do not really master the consonant sound pronunciation of Indonesian language, which is apparent from the inability and consistent mispronunciation in pronouncing certain sounds. And from the aspect of morphology, the student can construct words using affix that form active verb, but cannot construct words using affix that form passive verb. The student has been able to construct a simple and complex sentence with two clauses, yet they have difficulties in changing an active sentence to passive and vice versa. The mapping of teaching materials on the linguistic aspect was conducted with a principle of order and emphasis on material based on the finding of the characteristic. Okay, that's all of my presentation. Thank you.